He walked through this terminal with quiet shoes and a heavier silence in his chest. The kind of silence that doesn't come from noise-canceling headphones or flight delays, but from being reminded, once again, that some people will always see him as less. Eli Monroe wasn't wearing anything flashy, just a fitted navy jacket, a crisp button-down shirt, pressed trousers, and a small, barely noticeable rainbow pin near his collar. Barely noticeable until it wasn't. His boarding pass read 2A, business class, window seat. It wasn't a gift. It wasn't indulgence. It was a gesture from someone who understood him before the world ever tried to change him. His grandmother had booked the ticket 3 months ago, knowing she might not be around to sit beside him. She'd always been like that, gentle but certain. The kind of woman who folded napkins into daisies and reminded him that his worth was not up for negotiation. But today, the only thing beside Eli would be a tray table that barely locked and the hum of a bathroom door that never stayed shut. At the check-in counter, the agent barely met his eyes. They scanned his ticket, glanced at the pin on his chest, then exchanged a short whisper with a colleague. Something unreadable passed between them, something that felt rehearsed. "Looks like there's been a last-minute seat change," one of them said politely, but without warmth. "You're now in 34D. No apology, no explanation, just a new boarding pass. Coach, last row." Right next to the lavatory, Eli didn't argue. Not because he didn't care, but because he was tired. Because he knew that if he raised his voice, they'd say he was difficult. If he asked why, they'd say the system glitched. If he cried them, they'd just blink, so he nodded once, said thank you, and walked away. Inside, though, something cracked. Not loudly but cleanly, like ice under weight. This wasn't just another flight. This wasn't a casual trip. This was the flight home for his grandmother's funeral. The only person who never made him feel like an apology. The only person who used to lace his fingers with kindness when the world looked away. She had wanted him to sit up front, to be seen, to be acknowledged. But now he would ride the skies like excess baggage tucked behind strangers and forgotten by design. Eli reached row 34. His seat didn't recline. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and tired feet. But he sat, folded his coat neatly over his lap, and looked out the tiny scratched window. He didn't cry. He just remembered. He remembered how she would cup his cheeks with thin hands and say, "They may not understand you yet, Eli, but that doesn't mean you're lost." He remembered the last call, when her voice was already faint. She told him, "Come home, baby. I've left a place for you." But the seat was gone now, reassigned, like it had never belonged to him at all. Still, he breathed, slowly, deeply, like she had taught him. Because dignity, she'd once said, isn't loud, it's how you carry yourself. When the world thinks it can fold you small. Outside, the sky was gray, veined with streaks of rain across the windows. Somewhere in the belly of the plane, his luggage moved without him. He wondered if they'd at least treat that with care. He turned his head and closed his eyes. He didn't know yet that someone would notice, that someone small and unexpected would see more than the seat number. He didn't know yet that this flight wasn't about getting home. It was about showing the world he still belonged in the light. If this story moved you, follow Heart's story for more true-to-life narratives of quiet strength, identity, and the unexpected kindness that changes everything. The seat beside Eli remained empty until boarding was almost complete. Then, a pair of hurried footsteps shuffled into the aisle, a woman in her 30s, hair pinned up tightly, phone still glowing in her hand. Behind her, a boy trailed with a backpack too big for his frame and sneakers that lit up faintly with each step. 34C, the woman asked the flight attendant without looking up from her screen. Her voice was clipped, distracted. She pointed toward the row and nudged the boy forward. "Sit, I have emails." The boy obeyed. He slid into the seat beside Eli with a small thump, arms wrapping tightly around his backpack. His mother didn't sit, her seat was a row ahead. Diagonally across, and she quickly resumed tapping at her phone with mechanical focus. Already gone in presence. The boy said nothing at first, just stared straight ahead, then sideways, then down at Eli's hands folded neatly in his lap. Then he noticed a small rainbow pin on Eli's jacket. Bright in color, quiet in meaning. But to children, nothing is subtle. He tilted his head, eyes narrowing in curiosity. Is that for people who love different? Eli turned slightly, surprised but unoffended. Yes, he said softly. Something like that. The boy's face scrunched. Are you the kind of boy my dad says shouldn't get married? There was no malice in his voice, only an honest confusion, like a child reciting something they don't understand. Eli smiled, gently, without flinching. What do you think? He asked. The boy looked at him carefully. I think you seem kind. That was all. But in that single exchange, something in Eli's chest eased, a flicker of warmth against the chill that had followed him on board. My name's Caleb, the boy added, like it was the most important thing in the world to share. Eli. Caleb leaned back in his seat, still glancing at the pin now and then. He didn't ask more about it. Kids know when to move on. They sat in companionable silence as the plane began to taxi. The engines hummed beneath them, low and constant. After a few minutes, Caleb pulled out a small packet of tissues from his pocket. He fumbled for a crumpled piece of paper inside, folded into the shape of a flower. My teacher taught us how to make these last week, he said, holding it out proudly. But mine looked all sad, like it got rained on. Eli smiled again, this time with something more than politeness. My grandmother used to make flowers from napkins, daisies mostly. She said they were stubborn like people who don't give up. Caleb's eyes widened. Did she teach you too? Yes, she taught me how to make them and how to live like I'm worth something. Even when the world tries to shrink me. Shrink you how? Caleb asked. Eli paused. The hum of the aircraft filled the space between them. He didn't need to explain everything to this child, but somehow he wanted to. By telling me my life didn't belong, that I was too soft, too loud, too different. Caleb nodded, as if that made perfect sense. People at school say I talk weird, but I think I just have more thoughts than my mouth can catch. Eli laughed quiet, from the chest. That sounds about right. Unbeknownst to them, a few passengers nearby had begun to listen. It wasn't obvious, no one turned their heads. But shoulders stilled. A man lowered his magazine. A woman paused her music. The words, small and warm, were doing something, slipping through the cracks of aisle and tension. Eli reached into his bag and pulled out a napkin. He began folding slowly, fingers moving with quiet skill. Caleb watched, transfixed. After a moment, a soft paper daisy bloomed in his hand. For you, Eli said. Caleb took it like treasure. I'm going to keep this, even if it gets squished. From a row up, his mother still hadn't looked back. Her phone glowed, her fingers danced. But the boy beside Eli was fully present, like someone who had chosen the company of kindness over silence. The flight continued. The cabin dimmed slightly. Outside, clouds shifted like soft rivers in the sky. In the very last row of a plane headed nowhere special, something small but unforgettable had begun to take root. And it wasn't just a flower made of napkin, it was the beginning of someone being truly seen. The aisle lights dimmed, casting a soft yellow glow over the cabin. The hum of the engines had become a steady rhythm, lulling most passengers into quiet reading, shallow naps, or idle scrolling. Eli remained still in his seat, hands folded loosely in his lap, as Caleb now leaned against the window, humming faintly, the paper daisy cradled between his fingers. It could have been a quiet flight, uneventful, forgettable, until he came. The sound of polished shoes against the plane's narrow aisle came first, steady, precise, unnervingly intentional. A man in a dark tailored suit, hair combed with military sharpness, walked down from the front of the plane. Each step measured like a verdict. He didn't look around. His eyes locked on one destination, Eli. The man stopped directly across from their row. He didn't speak Eli's name. He didn't need to. Eli's body stiffened. His breath caught before his eyes even met the man's face. It was his father. He looked the same as always. Immaculately dressed, spine straight as judgment, expression carved from stone. There was no hesitation in his voice, no flicker of recognition, just cold command as he turned to the nearest flight attendant. "I don't want him embarrassing me in front of my colleagues," he said, loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "Can you keep him quiet?" There it was, not a greeting, not a question. A public performance of disapproval, masked as a request. His father didn't even glance at Eli as he spoke, as if Eli was a misplaced coat someone had left in the wrong row. Eli didn't speak. He didn't move. The words didn't shock him, but that didn't mean they didn't bruise. Around them, passengers began to shift uncomfortably. One woman stopped sipping her drink mid-motion. A man folded his newspaper slower than necessary. Someone cleared their throat. The atmosphere changed, not loud, but charged, like static just before a storm. Caleb sat up. He looked at the man, then at Eli, confusion tightening his brow. "Why is everyone mad at him?" Caleb asked suddenly, his voice too loud to ignore. "He was the only one kind to me." The row fell silent, then the rows nearby, then the aisle. The words landed like a small stone in still water, rippling outward. Conversation stopped. Headphones slid off. People turned, not dramatically, but just enough to show they were listening now, fully present in this moment they hadn't asked for but couldn't ignore. The man in the suit stiffened. Eli blinked, slow and deliberate, keeping his gaze low. But inside, something cracked again, this time in the opposite direction. A break toward light, a fracture into space he had long been denied. Caleb's voice had no sharpness, no intention to confront. It was only truth naive, unfiltered, and more powerful than any prepared speech. The boy's mother finally looked up, momentarily pulled from her phone by the shifting energy. She glanced around, confused by the sudden stillness, then at her son, who now sat with his tiny shoulders squared like he had said something very important, and he had. The man didn't reply. He stood there, lips parted as if words had betrayed him. He glanced at a pair of sharply dressed men seated near the front, his colleagues, perhaps, and then back toward Eli, who still hadn't said a word. The silence had become deafening. No one rose in defense. No one clapped, but no one laughed either. No one looked away. That was new. Usually, Eli knew. Shame came with isolation. But this time, in this small metal tube in the sky, shame had found its rightful target. His father turned away. No parting word. Just retreat back up the aisle. Back to comfort. Back to a seat bought by pride but lost to silence. Eli exhaled. Not relief, not triumph. Just breath. Steady and long. Like someone taking up space on purpose. Caleb turned to him. "Was that your dad?" Eli nodded once. "Then he doesn't know what a real man is," Caleb said, matter of fact. "My grandpa says real men make people feel safe." And with that, Caleb leaned his head back against the window once more, the paper daisy still in his lap. Eli didn't speak. He didn't need to, because sometimes the world speaks for you through the voice of a child, through the stillness of strangers, through the retreat of someone who used to hold all the power. And for the first time in a long time, Eli felt the echo of something he thought he'd buried with his grandmother dignity, not just remembered, but returned. The cabin settled into an uneasy quiet after the confrontation. Eli remained still, his body upright but calm, as if he'd rehearsed silence for a lifetime. He didn't need to check if people were still watching. He could feel it. The kind of attention that clings not from curiosity, but from guilt, from quiet reflection, from the understanding that something wrong had just passed through the aisle like turbulence, and they had all witnessed it. Some went back to their screens, others stared ahead, unsure whether to acknowledge what had just occurred. Eli didn't shift in his seat. His hands rested on his lap, one thumb gently brushing the corner of his rainbow pin, not out of insecurity, but as a small act of grounding. Then came the sound of the cockpit door opening. It wasn't rushed, not dramatic, just deliberate. From the front of the plane, a woman in uniform emerged, tall, poised, silver streaks lining her tightly pulled back hair. She had the calm demeanor of someone who had flown through more than clouds in her career. Every passenger seemed to register her at once the pilot. She made her way down the aisle slowly, her eyes scanning the rows, until she stopped near the back, just a few steps from Eli. The moment hung in the air, fragile and full. She addressed the cabin with the kind of voice that didn't ask for authority, it already had it. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "I was informed there may have been a mistake with seating earlier." She paused. Her gaze drifted toward Eli, soft, measured, and entirely focused. "There's a passenger who purchased a business class seat, specifically seat 2A. I'd like to ask, does anyone wish to return it to its rightful owner?" Her words weren't accusatory, but they weren't passive either. They carried weight, a challenge wrapped in civility. Silence. Not a single passenger in business class moved. No one spoke. No one volunteered. A few avoided eye contact. One man coughed into his sleeve. Another adjusted his neck pillow. The pilot gave them a beat longer. Then she nodded slowly, as if their silence had confirmed something she already knew. She turned back to Eli, her voice no longer for the whole cabin, but for him alone. "Then I will," she said simply. "That seat is mine. I've flown enough miles for it." "But you've flown through more than skies." Eli looked up at her, caught off guard by the shift in tone. She smiled gently, lowering her voice even further. "I've read your articles, my daughter. She found strength in them. She came out because of you. So please come forward." The plane wasn't silent anymore. It was reverent. The woman didn't say another word. She simply stepped aside, giving Eli the choice. No pressure, no spotlight, just an open aisle, in a place that had always been his to begin with. Caleb looked at him, eyes wide. "You're going?" Eli nodded. The boy smiled and offered him the napkin daisy again. For luck, Eli didn't take it. Instead, he gently closed Caleb's fingers around it. "For you, keep it blooming." Then, with a steady breath, Eli rose. He didn't rush. He didn't bow his head. He stood tall, his back straight, his jacket smooth from where he'd pressed it, for the flight still creased with intention. Still proud. As he walked up the aisle, the shift was palpable. Passengers leaned back to make space. Some lowered their headphones. A few held his gaze soft, respectful. A couple whispered, but this time the whispers weren't sharp. He passed his father without looking at him. The man did not speak. Eli continued to the front of the plane, where the pilot gestured toward 2A, the seat that was always meant for him. He took it without hesitation. Outside the window, clouds stretched endlessly in pale blue layers. But inside, something far more grounded had taken flight. He didn't recline. He didn't toast. He just looked out the window with quiet dignity as the captain returned to her place behind the locked door. And for the first time since boarding, Eli allowed himself a breath that didn't carry weight, not because things had been fixed, but because something had shifted. And it started with one voice, one child, one pilot, and a seat reclaimed, not just on a plane, but in the eyes of a world that finally paused long enough to see. From his new seat in 2A, Eli watched the clouds shift like soft parchment outside the window. The hum of the engines had changed, not in pitch, but in feeling. It no longer pressed against his chest. It lifted instead, as if the aircraft itself had corrected something deeper than a booking error. There were no announcements made about him, no dramatic turn of events, yet the energy inside the plane had undeniably shifted. Not all at once, not loudly, but in the stillness between each seatbelt click, something in the air had softened. Some passengers had resumed their usual routines. Others didn't. One by one, a few removed their headphones. Some glanced up, not at him, but toward him. Not invasive, but intentional. Eli didn't smile. He didn't wave. He simply sat as he had always meant to, upright, quiet, unapologetically present. When the flight attendants came down the aisle for final service, one of them, a younger man with tired eyes and a tight jaw, paused briefly at Eli's row. No words, just a glance, a small nod, and the offer of water without being asked. It was a gesture that said more than anything printed on a company policy. As the plane began its descent, a chime signaled the cabin crew to prepare for landing. The seatbelt signs lit up, trays locked, phones dimmed, but just before the flight attendants took their seats, one of them returned to Eli and leaned in gently. "The captain asked," he said, "if you'd like to say the closing announcement." Eli looked up, startled. "I think she believes it might help someone," the attendant added. Then he smiled, almost embarrassed by his own suggestion. "But no pressure." Eli hesitated. He had never liked microphones, never liked speaking in front of strangers, especially after being forced into so many rooms that made him feel like a stranger in his own skin. But then a small movement caught his eye. From the middle of the cabin, Caleb stood in his seat, turned toward the front. He wasn't waving, just watching. And then he mouthed the words too softly to hear, but unmistakably clear. "If you say it, maybe someone else will be brave too." Eli closed his eyes for a moment. Then he stood. The attendant handed him the microphone. Eli held it, feeling the subtle weight of plastic and silence. Then he spoke. His voice didn't shake. It didn't rise. It just carried. "I was moved to the back for who I am, but kindness has no seat number, and respect, it's earned by how we treat each other when no one is watching." That was all. He handed the microphone back. No applause, just stillness. And then a rustle of motion. One by one, as the plane touched down on the tarmac, passengers began to stand. Not all at once, not in unison, but steadily, row after row. They stood as the wheels hit the ground, not for turbulence, not for luggage, not for the seatbelt sign, but for him. Eli remained seated. Not out of humility, but because this time, the world was rising to meet him. From the corner of his eye, he saw his father looking away. And that was fine. Eli no longer needed him to look. Not after what had already been seen. Caleb's mother, now fully aware of what had unfolded, approached Eli as passengers began to disembark. She stopped beside him, eyes soft but unsure. "My son said you made him feel safe," she said. "For that, thank you, and I'm sorry for not noticing earlier." Eli nodded gently. "He noticed enough for both of you." She didn't reply, just placed a hand over her heart before turning back to her son, who now carried the napkin daisy like a badge. As Eli gathered his things, the pilot waited for him at the exit. "I meant what I said," she murmured. "You've flown through more than most." Then, lowering her voice, she added one last thing. "Your seat today was arranged 3 months ago. A special request. Your grandmother left a note for our manifest. She said if my grandson is treated unfairly, let him fly home with his head held high." She reached behind the cabin door and handed him a small printout, laminated official. At the bottom, typed in clean black ink, was a line of text under the VIP passenger manifest. "For Eli Monroe, from Grandma, with love." Eli didn't cry. He didn't need to. The world had already done it for him. He stepped off the plane not with triumph, but with truth. Because love, real love, prepares you for the storms and then teaches you how to land with grace. What would you have done if you were on that flight? Tell us in the comments below. Follow Heart Story for more true stories of quiet courage, unexpected redemption. and the moments that make us human.